Dr. Marcus, so President Bashar al-Assad on Monday received Patriarch Irinej, if I'm spelling his name right, of Serbia, and the accompanying delegation in the presence of Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and All East John X Yazigi. So I'm wondering, in what context can you put this visit of a religious figure, Orthodox religious figure from Serbia to Syria in 2019, knowing that the war in Syria was erupted in 2011, and during this time there were a lot of developments and especially systematic targeting of the Christian communities, let's say, by the so-called rebels in Syria?
Well, first of all, I should say this, that I applauded the visit of the Serbian Patriarch to Syria, and I was delighted to learn that the Patriarch met in person with President Assad. After all, there are many people in Syria who adhere to the Orthodox faith, and of course, Serbia is an overwhelmingly Orthodox country. But, and this is a big but, why didn't the Serbian Patriarch Irinej visit Syria, say, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, or 5 years ago? Why only now? Why only in 2019, when the war in Syria is finally coming to an end? Why didn't the Serbian Patriarch speak out about the persecution of Christians in Syria? For example, the persecution of Syrians who follow the Orthodox faith. Why didn't the Serbian Patriarch speak out about the horrendous destruction that has been wrought on Orthodox churches and monasteries in Syria, churches and monasteries that are many, many years old? Indeed, they go back in some respects hundreds and hundreds of years. So yes, I applaud the visit to Syria, but I think we do need to have a discussion as to why in 2019 and why not before.
Dr. Marcus, but the Patriarch, he applauded the Syria's war against terrorism, he mentioned it, and he wished a victory over the terrorist organizations. Okay, it's a good position from the Patriarchy, let's say in 2019, but how do you evaluate the state policies of Serbia during the last 8 years in regards to Syria, knowing that there could be some similarities? Of course, there are similarities between what's going on in Syria nowadays and what happened also to Serbia 2 decades ago.
I think it's important, Kavok, for me to set the scene before I answer that question directly. So, ever since the 5th of October 2000, Serbia has been a client state of America, of the European Union, and of NATO, because it was on the 5th of October 2000 when the Yugoslav president, Slobodan Milosevic, was overturned in what was openly an American, European orchestrated election campaign against him. The opposition that Mr. Milosevic was facing in the election in Serbia at that time were, of course, not a patriotic opposition. They were, in simple terms, working for the interests of foreign powers. And indeed, Mr. Milosevic, in his last speech to Serbia, or as it was then, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which comprised Serbia and Montenegro, Mr. Milosevic warned the people of Yugoslavia who this opposition, in inverted commas, really were and what they would do if they took power. Now, regrettably, many Serbs were naive about this so-called opposition and voted for them, and Mr. Milosevic lost power. But that election campaign was financed, was supported by the Americans and the Europeans. And I can cite so much evidence for this, Kavok, but let me just quote Madeleine Albright, who at the time was Secretary of State. And of course, she was going to be leaving the State Department at the end of 2000 because, of course, Bill Clinton's tenure was coming to an end. But Kavok, this is what Madeleine Albright said in the summer of 2000, before I leave office, I want to see Slobodan Milosevic out of power in Serbia. Now, that speaks plenty, doesn't it? So, what has happened in the last 19 years in Serbia? Serbia has now lost its national industries. It has lost its natural resources. Serbian national industries were initially privatized and then closed down, or they were sold to foreign businesses who then closed them down so that they could flood the Serbian market with their own goods. In key Serbian institutions today, there are NATO supervisory offices. Let me say that again, Kevork. There are NATO supervisory offices, not advisory offices, supervisory offices, including in the Serbian Defense Minister, the very building that NATO partly destroyed in its bombing campaign in 1999. So the people, the Serbian elite today in Serbia, the opposition in Serbia, are working for foreign powers, the Americans, the Europeans, and NATO. So I had to set the scene, Kevork, in order to answer your question. Now, Serbia is a secular country, as it was when it was the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and then when it was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So in Serbia today, there is a separation of church and state. So we could say that the Serbian Orthodox Church wasn't able to speak out during the terrible conflict in Syria, because of course Syria is a secular country. The reality is that a significant percentage, Kevork, of the leadership of the Serbian Orthodox Church is in cahoots with the Serbian elite, and therefore it is not in their interests to have spoken out about what's happening in Syria. Now, you will then ask me, well, why it is not in their interests? After all, Serbia is an Orthodox country, and there are many Orthodox believers in Syria. Well,
Dr. Marcus, some in Syria might say better late than never for what the, let's say, the Orthodox Patriarch did now in Syria, this visit to Syria. On the other hand, also others are questioning where is the Catholic Church or the Catholic Patriarchies of what's happening in Syria, knowing that the Catholics of Syria were also targeted to systematic targeting by the so-called rebels. I don't like to speak about these sectarian topics, but it's very important to understand how these patriarchies in the West, let's say, are thinking when it comes to Syria, knowing that a very big community, Orthodox and Catholic community, were targeted. And until this moment, we haven't heard big concerns from these religious institutions regarding what's going on in Syria.
Well, look, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the leadership of the Serbian Orthodox Church rejoiced when Slobodan Milosevic fell from power. Why? Because after that, Serbia experienced westernization politically, economically, culturally. And part of the agreement between the Serbian authorities and the Serbian Orthodox Church is that in return for the Serbian Orthodox Church supporting this westernization, they would get back the power, the wealth, the land that they lost in Serbia or Yugoslavia after 1945. And under Tito, the Serbian Orthodox Church was free, but it did not have the wealth. It did not control the land, the banks, the publishing houses that it had once controlled in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And after Tito's Yugoslavia imploded, Milosevic's Yugoslavia pretty much kept to that policy. Now, the Serbian Orthodox Church went along with the westernization because they wanted to get back their land, their wealth, their privileges. Part of the agreement would be that they would be willingly beholden to the Serbian elite. Now, that's what takes me on to Syria. For the last few years, certainly 4, but probably even 5, 6 years, the Serbian government, which is a client state of the Americans and NATO, has been supplying arms to Saudi Arabia, knowing that those arms would then be sent to the various terrorist groups in Syria, including ISIS, including Al-Qaeda, and including the so-called Free Syrian Army, which of course is another Wahhabi terrorist group. Serbia has one of the largest defense industries in the world. And the Serbian government have been supplying arms to the Saudis, which have then ended up in Syria, which have been responsible for the deaths of Syrian soldiers, Syrian prisoners of war, Syrian civilians. Indeed, it makes my stomach turn, Kevork, when I'm in Belgrade and I see significant numbers of Saudi arms dealers. So why didn't the Serbian Patriarch speak out before? There were restrictions placed on him by the Serbian elite because, of course, privately, the Serbian government has been supporting indirectly the terrorist groups in Syria. And it wouldn't have gone down well in Washington and Brussels and, of course, in Riyadh for the Serbian Patriarch to be traveling to Damascus on a regular basis, to be speaking out from Belgrade on a regular basis about how the Syrian government is facing terrorist groups and about how Orthodox believers have been massacred and Orthodox temples have been destroyed. That is why the Serbian Orthodox Church has been, up until this time, more or less silent. He has visited Damascus now for 2 reasons. Number one, because the war is coming to an end. You know that. I know that. President Assad knows that. The terrorists know that. The terrorist backers in Britain and America and Turkey and Saudi Arabia know that. So there's not much damage now in him going there. Also, there are good people in the leadership of the Serbian Orthodox Church who have been pressurizing him for some time now to speak out against what has happened, the systematic persecution and murder of Christians in Syria. So the Serbian Patriarch has had to maintain a balancing act. Number one, he wants to safeguard his relationship with the Serbian elite who are pro-Western, because of course he doesn't want to lose his privileges and his power. But at the same time, he needs to appease those good people in the Serbian Orthodox Church who are fully supportive of Syria in its battle against Wahhabi terrorists who have been backed by the West and other regional powers. So it's a balancing act. He has gone to Damascus because the war is coming to an end, and also he wants to be seen as, I did support the Christians in Syria. But as I said at the beginning of this interview, Kevork, if he was sincere about his support for the Christians in Syria, and let's say the Orthodox Christians, then why didn't he go in previous years? Why now?
Dr. Marcus, when I say there was and there is still a systematic targeting of the Christian communities, beside the bombing of churches and destroying it or occupying it, I want to mention one example. I'm sure our audience would like also to hear it. I still remember between 2012 and 2014, when the terrorists were trying to occupy the highways in Syria, especially the highway, the M4 and M5 highways that connects Aleppo to Hama, Homs to Damascus, and Aleppo to the coastal side of coastal part of Syria. I still remember we lost many friends while they were traveling on the highways. The so-called Free Syrian Army, they were going up into these buses asking for the IDs, and they check the names, and when they figure out that they are Christians or Armenians, they take them down and they disappear completely. They don't even call their parents asking for ransom or something. So there was a systematic, I call it a genocide, because even if you kill one person on the purpose of ethnically cleansing a religious group or a sectarian group and etc., it's still called genocide. So it mounted to genocide. And I have friends who were my colleagues in the school they just disappeared since 2012 while they were traveling from Aleppo to Damascus, because these so-called moderate rebels that the Western government support, they stopped the buses and they came in, they asked for the IDs, and they took the Christians, and these people were just disappeared, and we don't know anything yet about them. And their parents didn't even receive their corpses, their bodies, so they don't know even if they are dead or not. I'm sure after 8 years, unfortunately, the probability of them to be alive is very small, but very weak. But so this all happened all this time, and in 2019, when we speak about the pain of the Syrians, especially on social media, because nowadays social media is our only platform to express our pain and what we felt and what we witnessed and what we experienced in Syria, we get mocked by so-called Western pundits and journalists, calling us Assadists, conspiracy theorists, and etc. in a bid to discredit us, But thanks to God that the Syrian army prevailed all this time and they resisted this tsunami of Wahhabism, and it's for us very happy moment seeing the Syrian army recapturing Syria day by day, and now in Idlib. Hopefully this war could end in the next couple of years if we recapture everything.
Yeah.
Now, to ask you this last question, Dr. Marcus, we always hear about the Balkanization of Syria. Can we draw these parallels, these lines between what happened in the former Yugoslavia and in Syria? Do you think if Assad was gone, if the Western governments, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other regional governments succeeded to topple Assad let's say in 2012, 13, 14, we would have seen a Balkanization of Syria?
Oh, I don't have any doubts in my mind that that is exactly what would have happened. Remember, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was dismembered, was destroyed by Western powers in 91, 92, because the new order in Europe, following the end of communism in Eastern Europe, did not want a country which was run on socialist lines. And secondly, they did not want a country which had good relations with Russia that could have given Russia influence in the Balkans. That's why Tito's Yugoslavia, or Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, was destroyed. That is why the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Milosevic's Yugoslavia, was destroyed. And the Balkans today has again been colonized. The Balkans over centuries has been colonized by the Ottomans, by the Austro-Hungarians, by the Nazis, and today it's being colonized by the West, specifically America, the European Union, and NATO. And if the Syrian army had been defeated in those years, which is when it was, at its most vulnerable, I would say in particular 2013, 2014, beginning of 2015, then yes, of course, the Syrian state would have been dismantled. Western companies, Turkish companies, Saudi companies, other Gulf companies would have moved in to take over the economic infrastructure in that country. It would have become a hub for organized crime like Kosovo is today. Eventually, the Christian community in Syria would have been annihilated. The Shia community, the Alawite community would have been annihilated as well. And of course, Israel would have had influence in that Syria. So there is no question about it that there are parallels between what's happened in the Balkans and what could have happened in Syria. Now, there are a number of reasons why Syria has prevailed against, as you correctly described, this Wahhabi tsunami. The resolve of the Syrian people to defend their land, to defend their country, to defend their culture, their identity. Syrians don't want to be known as Christians, as Muslims, as Kurds. They want to be known as Syrians, and that's what they were fighting for. But, and this is crucial now, Russian support enabled Syria to survive, to live, because that's where that's where Serbia in 1999 was in a dire situation, because in the 1990s, Russia, of course, was on its knees politically, economically, militarily, in terms of societal terms. It was destroyed. Russia couldn't even find in the 1990s fuel for its tanks to parade on Red Square. That's why on Victory Day parades in the late 1990s, there were no tanks, because they couldn't afford to get the tanks out. But Russia, from 2015 to the present, is able to fight side by side with the Syrian army, because of course Russia under Vladimir Putin is again a superpower. Russia can now find the money for its military to be permanently based in Syria and to be on a daily basis, if need be, to be bombing the various terrorist groups in Idlib. So unfortunately, the 1990s, the Serbs, despite fighting and fighting and fighting, they were on their own. The Syrians, they had the same fighting capabilities as the Serbs. They had the same resolve as the Serbs, but they were blessed to have a superpower backing them, and a superpower in the name of Russia.
Dr. Marcus, you perfectly describe the steadfastness of the Syrian people and their willingness to describe themselves and identify themselves as Syrians, as a macro identity before identifying themselves with any micro identity. And it was a lesson for a lot of people around the world who are also resisting the American hegemony and their determination to topple their governments. If the Syrian army was destroyed in 2013 and 14, beside the division of Syria, we would have seen slave markets in Syria, open air slave markets, as it's happening in Libya. And it's what happened in the next 2 decades is an open book for all of us to read and take lessons of what happened in Yugoslavia, of what happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in Libya, and elsewhere. But unfortunately, until this moment, there are some people still resisting to understand this basic facts of international politics. But thanks to you and thanks to many other independent journalists who are also a voice for the oppressed people, especially now the Syrian people, the Palestinian people, and etc. I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Marcus, for your time, for your great insights and analysis of what's going on. God bless you. And I will host you again, hopefully soon, on Syrian Analyst to discuss other issues.
Thank you very much, Kavok, for having me on. It was a pleasure.